Hello and welcome to the Blue Report Backstage. I am Rich Smith, editor of the Blue Report, and we have a real treat for you this month. We are speaking with an actress who has been gracing the stage and screen for 30 years. You know her as a Vulcan doctor, a half-Klingon ambassador, an Andorian soldier, and an omnipotent Q, which I'm assuming is not far from the truth. We are pleased to welcome Suzie Plakson. How are you today?
I'm fine, and I'm very touched by your beautiful introduction, and forgive me for having broken your stride with a scream of horror, but, one never thinks one's going to be, alive for, 30 years ago. You just don't think you're going to be that person, but there I am.
I find myself pointing out friends that I've known for 25 years, and it's like, wow, I've known somebody for 25 years.
Yes. And you can't tell a 25-year-old that they'll ever be saying that, but they're
absolutely.
But there it is.
I was interested. How did you get involved in the arts? You do so many things.
Well, I think the entry point is always where the passion took hold or takes hold. And for me, it was when I was a kid and I used to watch old movies with my mother late at night, and I would watch Masterpiece Theater, and I began to realize that when I saw Mary Poppins, I liked to imitate Mary Poppins, and I took an elocution class. That's how long ago it was, thousands of years ago, and they called things elocution. And I adored the poem that they gave me and the quiet of the audience and the beauty of the words. And I think I got bitten by the theater performance bug first. And then as I began to be, and I don't say this from a victim stance, but I say this as just a natural evolution, by being rather frustrated acting-wise for a long time, I needed to find other outlets for the art, and I just began to. And each one has its own genesis, of course, but that may take longer than the radio interview to tell you those. But that's basically it. It's the point. I think point of passion is the entry point.
Well, most of our listeners would know you from the Star Trek universe, obviously.
Yeah, and of course.
They'd like to know, of the 4 characters you've played, you played 2 on The Next Generation, 1 on Voyager, and 1 on Enterprise. Which one was your favorite?
Well, I know that the martyred popular is poor dear dead Kalar, but I love the Q. I love that kind of arch and narcissistic, witty banter, and I would have loved to come back as the Q. So I would have to say the Q, for sure.
I was watching that episode the other night in preparation for the interview, and I love it when you say, I'm not talking about the puppy.
Do you know, it's so funny, Rich, about that line is that I always get quoted that particular line. It's the line that people will speak to me as the Q, and what I find humorous about it is that as I was doing the line, the director pulled me to the side, and with sort of disgust, he said, you're doing that, and it sounds just like Betty Davis. And I'm thinking to myself, pal, that ain't a bad thing. And everybody laughed, and I just think it's really funny. I kind of pretended to change it a little bit, but they didn't have much time, so I let him think I was kind of an idiot and didn't quite understand what he meant, and pretty much delivered it the same way. And I just think it's so funny that, thousands of years later, people like that line the best. So. But, yes, that was a good line. I was given a little gift there.
You mentioned that people come up to you and quote that line, and you really do enjoy meeting the fans at conventions. What makes that just incredible for you?
It's such a spectrum of experience. What makes it beautiful in so many ways is to just connect human to human, as it were, even that some of us, including me, were probably alien to the planet originally. but human being to human being, to be able to know that you've touched someone by just, showing up at some point, that there are just some beautiful stories and beautiful people out there saying wonderful things, and I feel very blessed and honored to be able to, I always think of the Star Trek convention as kind of a global block party. It's kind of ongoing, and I love the connection. What makes it more exciting for me in some ways is when discussions and connections go beyond talking about Star Trek. And I don't mean, sitcoms I've been in or movies or whatever, but just beyond it. I find it a wonderful, I've just been so honored and blessed to be part of it, the wonderful venue by which to connect to a much broader audience than I would ever have been exposed to had I been only, guest starring on sitcoms or et cetera, or doing stage work.
You mentioned those, and, off-Trek roles. What are some of that stand out as your favorites? You've done quite a few.
Well, there are two that almost no one would know, and one of them is I actually wrote and will likely go back to and expand on something in which I play Eve, and it's a philosophical comedy, and that was a solo show. And I loved doing that, loved the connection, loved to hear ideas in my head work. I'm very fascinated with myth. I'm very fascinated with its effect on society. And also I played a character called Mary Margaret Tynan, Meg Tynan, on a little-known sitcom for about 3 years called Love and War. And I played a sports writer, and she was incredibly tough and no bullshit, and I just loved playing somebody who is so tough, knew her own mind. And, of course, I know nothing about sports, so it's always fun to play someone absolutely no connection with in real life, because that's the joy of transforming. And the other one that resonates me the most deeply, even though it was an entirely vocal performance, is The Return of King Lillian, which is a new myth that I wrote and recorded and played all the characters. And the performance of that was incredibly rigorous and thoroughly satisfying.
We had someone ask us about your work on Mad About You. What was gratifying about that experience?
Well, it was a big hit at the time, and they had a lot of amazing guest people. And I think my most gratifying moment of that was something that just happened off stage, had nothing to do with anything, but I met Sid Caesar and had a lovely little chat with him and saw what a poetic and kind and amazing human being he was. And that sort of thing doesn't happen if you're sitting at home.
And, you had mentioned the Eve project. It's called An Evening with Eve. And can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I had always been fascinated by the beginnings of what is affectionately known as Judeo-Christian culture. And I have always read all sorts of thick scholarly tomes, none of which I can really keep in my head all at the same time, but trying to distill the effect of myth on the way we think about things. The way that we have thought about Eve since for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, what has it affected? And so my mission was, and again, it was only partial because I did about 30 minutes, and there were 4 women doing solo shows that evening, so mine was the first up. But my mission was to distill comedy and deep philosophical comedy from all this stuff that I'd read, and it's the idea for the solo show that's a more expanded version of it, which one day I am pretty determined to get to. It's just that it's quite daunting, which involves, and she was talking on stage, she would take a lot of phone calls, and they would be from people like Lilith and Medusa and Aphrodite, and it was fascinating to see how the audience really grokked the idea of these characters having lives and interactions, and I would have them interact in a very sort of, I guess you could say, Woody Allen kind of way, not to say anything about the quality, but just about the fancifulness. They would be interacting, or she'd tell stories about, how she had this fling with Jung and, things like that, Carl Jung, that is. And I would pepper the entire thing with little musical quotes here and there, because I always think that music tends to uplift a thing and imprint it more deeply on people's psyches. And it's just something I tend to do. It was a very fluid piece, and I would transform into certain other characters as I was talking about them. So it's kind of a thing I do, generally, is I think I'm when I say a thing I do, is I become very enamored with myth, with creating new myths, with examining and dissolving old myth, which I think, has outlived its time.
I'm glad you mentioned music because many people may not know that you're also a singer. I was on your website and you highlight a song called "Didn't Want to Do It," and I gotta say it has risen up on my list because it's what we would all like to do if laws didn't get in the way.
And if pesky reality didn't get in the way. That actually is something I wrote as well. I wrote all the songs on that album, Didn't Want to Do It. And I think that every work of art, songs included, has a mind of its own. And it's like I'm the receiver, and the way that it happens, and this may answer a why ultimately, but the way that it happens, I was already in the midst of creating this album with Jay Ferguson, formerly of Spirit, formerly of JoJo Gunn, and what he would do, because I don't play an instrument, I would get an idea, and I'd say, oh, you know what, I want a song with this kind of groove. And he plays all the instruments, and I said, just let's come up with a kind of a groove that has this kind of a beat to it, and because I just want to write something with that would be fun. And he gave me 7 minutes and 51 seconds, and I put it in, and part of the way that I would receive some songs, when I say receive, I mean like the muse, knocking on your door, and then I threw the CD into the CD player and drove around the city a lot. And as I'm driving, I'm starting to sing this song about blowing things up. Like it's coming to me, like it's funny, and I'm saying, and it's coming to me, in other words. And I can't remember which part, at this moment when you're asking, I can't remember which part came first, but I was just like, what the hell am I writing? What is this? What am I writing? I can't believe I'm writing a song about blowing things up. I am a totally, let's say, really committedly peaceable person. Do I experience anger? Of course. Massive frustration? You bet. Fantasies of violence? Okay. But it surprised me immeasurably that I was writing this, and it troubled me. And I brought it to Jay, and I said, Jay, I'm going to sing some of this to you, and I'm a little freaked out that I'm writing it, but every time I try not to write it and to not have it be what it's about, it won't, I can't get the rest of it. And so I sang parts of it to him, and he said, this is so funny and so much fun, and people feel this way, and stop doubting it. So I just pulled the rest of it in, and I just think of it as more like a mad musical monologue than a song. But yeah, that's where it came from.
Well, you act and you sing, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier. You are an author, and The Return of King Lillian is what you've been working on recently. Now, I went and I listened to some excerpts online, and it sounds like a really fun adventure story. The site calls it a mythic journey for dreamers and nonconformists of all ages. So I got to ask, did you grow up loving stories like this?
Yes, I did, most definitely. I grew up loving Sword in the Stone. I grew up loving Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz and Candide. And I saw Lillian in a dream literally about 30-some years ago. And I didn't know that was her name. And maybe a year later, I got a flash of that world again. And I just started to get obsessed with it. And for a long, 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 long time, I said, I am not. It's so funny when you say you're an author. I'm like, no, not really. I mean, I wrote this thing, but, authors to me are real writers, like writers do when they're done with one book. They sit down and write the next one. That's an author. I think I'm an author just because I happen to have written a book. And this is not about a matter of semantics with you. In my own head, I'm like, I think I'm a multimedia artist, and whatever comes out, I have to write because no one else will do it. But yes, I have always loved stories like this. And it's not sometimes people think of fantasy adventure like Lord of the Rings or something like this, and they're big, and there is that, not in a huge way, but in a more allegorical fashion, particularly in the second book, as Lillian grows older, much of it is in diary form. The story does get darker and deeper, and there definitely are deeper and darker themes in it. And there's a narrative wraparound as well. It's a very circular story, particularly when you listen to it on the audiobook.
Oh, it's, awesome. And people may not understand King Lillian. There's a heroine but it's a king, and it's because she inherited the title from her father, and then goes on this epic adventure after she's thrown out of her own kingdom.
Correct. And, it just felt, that's something that I did not design, the title. Years ago, this story was apparently steeping in my subconscious for so long. And literally, I would have dreams every couple of years. And I tried to write it and didn't have enough story, didn't know how to do it, didn't know how to put it down. But anyway, I was sitting, and at the time, it didn't really have a name. And someone had painted a sky on my wall and had used a piece of plywood to practice on. So I was using that piece of plywood with painted sky as a lap board, a lap desk. And at some point I was staring at it and I was thinking about the story, and I saw, in my mind's eye, of course, written across that lap board, The Return of King Lillian. And I burst out laughing. I don't know why. I mean, Henri Bergson, who writes about laughter, says that a big part of laughter is recognition, deep recognition. Perhaps after all that time I recognized it as the title of this, but I also knew that meant that there was an enormous amount of comedy in it, because I don't think I could do something like that without there being a lot of comedy in it. But I have always had such a passion for fantasy and allegory, and as I say, myth, that I feel like in some ways I've gone through life, there was a blender in my brain somewhere, and it all came out as The Return of King Lillian.
And how will people be able to get a copy of that?
Well, on June 3rd, I was about to say 1958, but that's impossible now, but June 3rd, 2015, which is my birthday, I'm going to be sending out 100 free audiobooks. There's still quite a few left, and people, all they have to do is write to www.SuziePlakson.com, info@SuziePlakson.com. That's my website, but it's just, the contact on the website, info@SuziePlakson.com, and say, I would like a free audiobook of The Return of King Lillian, and I will send them the MP3 links to it.
Awesome. That is really cool.
Why, yes. It just came to me as something, it's nice to give presents on your birthday. It feels good.
Well, what else have you got coming up? Are you doing any convention appearances or new projects?
At this moment, there are no convention appearances scheduled, but I am working on, rather returning to, I should say, creativity coaching and creativity. I hate the word coaching. It makes me nuts. I start to say sometimes creativity counseling, but that to me sounds pretentious. I still haven't found the right moniker for it, but I get clients who are interested in, sometimes it's just feedback on stories they've been writing, sometimes it's feedback on acting, sometimes it's feeling stuck, and there are certain exercises I give, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really doing more of that now, which I love, and speaking about creativity and the healing effects of it as well. So that's become something that I don't know. I might be steeping myself in that more and more in the future.
Well, we're going to wrap things up, Suzie, but thank you so much again for being with us today. We certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you so very much, Rich. I've had a blast, and you're a terrific interviewer, and I just wish everybody all good things, and I'm much appreciative of the whole Star Trek fan base, because you guys have just been so beautiful and generous and kind and all sorts of good things. So just want to send some love back at you.